This set of slides is on foundations and endowments. So foundations typically are grant-making institutions funded by gifts and investment assets. They're typically created by a single donor for philanthropic aims. And an example might be the McGrath Foundation, who raises money for research and treatment of breast cancer, so you might be aware of that one. And endowments are long-term funds generally owned by operating non-profit institutions like universities, hospitals, and charities. They're often built up over time from many gifts. Spending distributions are determined by the endowed institution to supplement other revenue, for example, tuition fees if it's a university or teaching related. There are 4 different types of foundations. They are independent foundation, which is usually private or family, which may be established to aid social, educational, charitable, or religious activities, and the source of funds generally come from the family. There's company-sponsored foundations, and the source of funds may come from an endowment and or annual contributions from the profit-making corporation. There's an operating foundation, which is an organization that uses its resources to conduct research or provide a direct service. And it's largely the same as an independent foundation in that funds generally come from the individual, family, or groups of individuals. And the community foundation, which is a publicly supported organization that makes grants for social, educational, charitable, or religious purposes. It's a type of public charity, and there may be multiple donors. So return and risk objectives. So they can vary widely in their investment goals and time horizons. We're talking about foundations. It may be the sole source of funding for a charitable program, thus requiring stable cash flows. Sometimes a foundation may address a problem with a limited time horizon or an urgent need, like responding to a natural disaster. The risk objectives, because their goals are different, it's hard to say in general, but they can, in general, have higher risk tolerance. Foundations do not have the liability that pension funds have. And their return objectives differ in their purpose, so vary in their return objectives. Some are short-lived, others operate in perpetuity. And constraints. So the liquidity constraint comprises of anticipated and unanticipated needs for cash in excess of contributions. Anticipated needs are determined by its spending rate. Foundations often seek to spend the minimum and employ a smoothing rule. On time horizon, most intend to operate in perpetuity, so they need to preserve their capital in real terms after spending. Tax concerns, so they have a low tax rate on income. It depends on the jurisdiction, but usually there are some tax concessions. Legal and regulatory environment, so they are regulated in most jurisdictions and it varies across jurisdictions. Unique circumstances, so a special challenge faces foundations that are endowed with stock of one particular company and that are then restricted by the donor from diversifying. The asset value of such an institution is obviously subject to the large market fluctuations attendant to any one stock position. With the permission of the donor, some institutions have entered into a swap agreement or other derivative transactions to achieve the payoffs of a more diversified portfolio. Such a strategy achieves the donor's goals of retaining voting rights in the stock while providing the foundation with a more stable asset value. Other institutions simply tolerate the fluctuations associated with a single stock position. There are 2 meanings for endowments. There's a long-term investment portfolio of a charitable organization, that's the ordinary meaning, and there's the permanent fund established by a donor with a conditioned fund principle which must be maintained over time. That's the legal and formal meaning. They're not subject to specific legally required spending levels. And the true endowment is where donors stipulate periodic spending distributions from the fund to pay for programs and that the fund principal is to be maintained over time. True endowments permanently are restricted in terms of spending. In the US, endowments provide a significant amount of budgetary support for universities, colleges, private schools, hospitals, museums, and religious organizations. Determining spending. So large fluctuations in year-to-year spending can disrupt the endowed institution's operating budget, finances, and staffing. Therefore, spending distributions should be safe and reliable and sustainable. Most endowed institutions determine spending through policies based on total returns, as reflected in market values. A spending rule helps instill discipline into budgeting and financial management processes. Spending is typically calculated as a percentage, usually between 4 and 6%. They frequently use an average of trailing market values rather than current market value to provide greater stability in the distributions. In computing such an average, the manager may adjust historical market values to reflect inflation. A common simple rule might call for spending 5% of the average of the past 3 years' ending market values of the endowment. One problem is that emphasis is placed on market values 3 years ago. A more refined rule might use a geometrically declining average of trailing endowment values adjusted for inflation, which places more emphasis on recent market values and less on past market values. So this is the formula for the geometric smoothing rule. It's where spending equals the weighted average of the prior year's spending adjusted for inflation and the product of the spending rate times the market value at the beginning of the prior fiscal year. The smoothing rate is typically between 60% and 80%. That's the formula. Because most endowed institutions complete their budget planning processes well before the endowment market value at the beginning of the fiscal year becomes known, it's advisable to calculate the spending from an endowment value based on a date in advance of the final budget process. The geometric smoothing rule description reflects this approach and uses the prior year's beginning rather than ending endowment market value. So return and risk objectives. Endowments have high return objectives, reflecting the goal of providing a significant, stable, and sustainable flow of income to operations. An endowment manager must balance the objective of providing substantial resources to programs with the need to provide for a stable cash flow. Furthermore, endowments must balance significant and stable spending objectives with the imperative to provide sustainable support. In other words, endowment funds should maintain their long-term purchasing power after inflation. Conventional mean variance analysis can help to suggest appropriate asset allocations. Computer simulations using Monte Carlo techniques can be extremely helpful in comparing and assessing investment spending policies and their ability to meet endowment objectives, because the Monte Carlo techniques are all about probabilities of achieving outcomes. The risk objectives, so they should be considered in conjunction with spending policy and in the context of its long-term objective of providing significant, stable, and sustainable stream of spending distributions. Spending policies with smoothing or averaging rules can dampen the transmission of portfolio volatility while striving for high, long-term investment returns necessary to fund programs and maintain purchasing power. Endowments that do not use a smoothing rule may have less tolerance for short-term portfolio risk. Investment portfolios with very low volatility or investment risk usually provide low expected returns, which increases the risk of failing to achieve the endowment's goals of significant, stable, and sustainable spending. Low investment risk does not equate to low risk for meeting endowment objectives. Because of the assumed positive relation between risk and return, a high required return objective, and a willingness to meet relatively high spending needs often imply a high willingness to accept risk. On the other hand, short-term performance pressures will indicate a low willingness to accept risk. Despite their long-term investment mandate, endowment managers often come under pressure to perform well over relatively short-term time horizons for several reasons. Poor investment results may lead to reductions in the level of endowment spending. In addition, investment staff and trustees with oversight responsibility are evaluated formally or informally on relatively short time frames, which are often yearly. And constraints. So liquidity constraints refer to the perpetual nature and measured spending of true endowments limits the need for liquidity. They need cash for distributions, but generally well suited to invest in illiquid assets such as unlisted infrastructure. They have extremely long-term time horizon as they intend to maintain the purchasing power in perpetuity. Taxes aren't a major concern. It does depend on the jurisdiction, but many charities and the like are exempt from taxes. Legal and regulatory environment only lightly regulated in most jurisdictions, and unique circumstances. It can be hard to say in general, and size differences matter, and they do vary widely in their size, governance and staff resources, and thus in the investment strategies that they can intelligently and practically pursue. They may have a financially unsophisticated management team or a financially savvy team with great expertise.